Hello, restless minds, and welcome to Sleeposaurus, your digital refuge for those moments when the world feels too loud and your brain needs something substantial to chew on. Whether you're settling in for the night, killing time on a long commute, or just need to escape the endless scroll of modern chaos, you've found the right corner of the internet. This is where we dig deep into the stories that shaped our world, told at a pace that lets your mind actually process what it's hearing. If you're the type of person who finds genuine fascination in the slow, methodical unraveling of Earth's deepest mysteries, then you're going to want to stick around. This isn't flashy content designed to grab your attention for 30 seconds and move on. This is the kind of storytelling that rewards patience, curiosity, and a willingness to sit with complex ideas until they start to make sense. Today, we're embarking on a journey that spans millions of years and tells one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the history of life itself. We're going to explore how our planet picked itself up, dusted itself off, and completely reinvented what it meant to be alive after the most catastrophic day in Earth's history. This is the story of how mammals went from hiding in burrows to ruling the world, how forests learned to grow again in poisoned soil, and how evolution itself had to get creative when all the old rules suddenly stopped working. And here's the thing about this story. It's not just ancient history. Every breath you take, every step you make, every thought that crosses your mind can be traced back to the choices life made in those critical millions of years after the dinosaurs disappeared. You exist because some small furry creatures figured out how to survive in a world that had forgotten how to be habitable. So let's dive in and let's take our time doing it. Picture this. 66 million years ago, Earth was having what you might call a very, very bad day. An asteroid the size of a mountain had just slammed into what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. And the planet was about to learn what it meant to start over from scratch. But this isn't a story about endings. This is a story about beginnings, about how life finds a way, even when that way seems impossible. The impact itself was devastating beyond imagination. In a single moment, the energy equivalent of billions of nuclear bombs was released into the atmosphere. The heat was so intense that forests thousands of miles away burst into flames. The shock wave flattened everything in its path. And then came the real killer, darkness. The sky filled with debris, ash, and chemicals that blocked out the sun for months, maybe years. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. Food chains collapsed. The age of the dinosaurs was over. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. Life didn't just survive this catastrophe. It thrived. Not immediately, not easily, but with a creativity and resilience that would fundamentally reshape what it meant to be alive on this planet. And the heroes of this story weren't the big, the strong, or the fierce. They were the small, the hidden, and the adaptable. When the dust finally began to settle, literally and figuratively, the world that emerged was almost unrecognizable. The great reptilian dynasties that had ruled for over 160 million years were gone. The oceans were quieter. The skies were emptier. But in the shadows, in the soil, in the forgotten corners of a broken world, something was stirring. Small mammals that had spent the entire Mesozoic era living in the margins suddenly found themselves inheriting an empty planet. These weren't the mammals you might expect. They weren't impressive. Most were no bigger than a modern rat, with simple teeth, basic behaviors, and survival strategies that could charitably be called hide and hope for the best. But they had something that the dinosaurs, for all their success, had lacked. They were really, really good at being small, flexible, and unnoticed. And in a world where the old rules no longer applied, those turned out to be exactly the right skills. The first phase of Earth's recovery was slow, strange, and surprisingly fungal. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, the planet's surface was covered in dead organic matter. Forests had burned, marine ecosystems had collapsed. The normal processes of decay and renewal were overwhelmed. But fungi, those often overlooked decomposers, stepped into the gap. They spread across the landscape like nature's cleanup crew, breaking down the apocalyptic debris and turning death back into soil. This wasn't just ecological housekeeping. It was the foundation of everything that would come next. As fungi processed the organic wreckage of the old world, they created the conditions for new life to take root. Plants began to return, not the towering conifers and cycads that had dominated the Mesozoic, but scrappy, fast-growing pioneers that could handle disturbed soil and uncertain conditions. These weren't the forests of the past. They were something entirely new. And into these recovering landscapes came the mammals, not as conquerors, but as opportunists. They were already well suited for a world in flux. Their warm-blooded metabolism allowed them to stay active in cooler temperatures. Their varied teeth could handle different types of food as resources shifted. Their relatively large brains, modest as they were, gave them the flexibility to adjust their behavior as conditions changed. But perhaps most importantly, they were small enough to hide when things got dangerous, and numerous enough that some would always survive local disasters. They were, in essence, evolution's insurance policy. And as the world began to stabilize, that insurance policy was about to pay off in ways no one could have predicted. The early Paleocene, the geological period that followed the extinction, was a time of experimentation on a planetary scale. Without the dinosaurs to fill the major ecological roles, evolution had to get creative. Mammals began branching out into niches that had been closed to them for millions of years. Some grew larger, taking advantage of the absence of giant predators. Others specialized in new types of food, from insects to seeds to the emerging flowering plants that were beginning to dominate the landscape. This wasn't a smooth process. Evolution never is. There were false starts, dead ends, and evolutionary experiments that lasted for millions of years before ultimately failing. But there was also innovation on a scale that the planet hadn't seen since the Cambrian explosion. New body plans emerged, new behaviors developed, new ecological relationships formed. One of the most significant changes was in the plants themselves. The impact had been particularly hard on forest ecosystems, but it had also created opportunities for new types of vegetation. Flowering plants, which had been steadily gaining ground throughout the Cretaceous, now found themselves in a world with reduced competition from conifers and ferns. They exploded in diversity, developing new strategies for reproduction, dispersal, and survival. This plant revolution had profound implications for the animals that depended on them, mammals that could take advantage of fruits, nuts, and seeds found themselves with new food sources. The coevolution of flowering plants and mammals became one of the driving forces of early Cenozoic evolution. Plants developed better ways to attract animal dispersers, while mammals developed better ways to process plant materials. But it wasn't just about food. The changing vegetation also created new types of habitats. Forests began to develop more complex vertical structure with distinct canopy layers that offered different opportunities for different species. Some mammals remained ground-dwelling, but others began to explore the three-dimensional world of the trees. This vertical expansion of mammalian life would eventually lead to some of the most significant evolutionary developments in our planet's history. The early mammals weren't just adapting to a new world. They were actively shaping it. Their behaviors, their feeding patterns, their movements across the landscape all influenced how ecosystems developed. They were becoming ecological engineers, species whose very presence changed the environment around them. As we move through this story, we'll see how these small, unassuming creatures gradually transformed from survivors into pioneers, from refugees into architects of a new world. We'll watch as they developed new ways of moving, new ways of thinking, and new ways of interacting with each other and their environment. We'll see how their success set the stage for everything that followed. The rise of the grasslands, the emergence of complex social behaviors, and eventually, the evolution of intelligence itself. This is the story of how Earth rebooted after its darkest hour. It's a story of resilience, adaptation, and the incredible creativity of life when faced with impossible circumstances. It's a story that took millions of years to unfold, but whose consequences we're still living with today. And it all started with some very small, very determined mammals who refused to give up on a broken world. So buckle in, get comfortable, and prepare to journey back to a time when the future of life on Earth hung in the balance, and the smallest creatures made the biggest difference. This is how mammals inherited the Earth, one small step at a time. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't pretty. For the first few million years after the impact, Earth looked like a planet caught between worlds. The old ecosystems were gone, but the new ones hadn't quite figured out what they wanted to be yet. It was a time of biological awkwardness, if you will. Imagine a teenager trying on different personalities, except the teenager was an entire planet, and the personalities were completely different ways of organizing life. The mammals that emerged from their post-apocalyptic hiding spots found themselves in a world that was both empty and full of possibilities. Empty because the ecological niches that had been filled by dinosaurs for over 160 million years were suddenly vacant. Full of possibilities because, well, those niches were suddenly vacant. But filling them wouldn't be as simple as just growing bigger and calling it a day. You see, the early mammals had spent so long being small and secretive that they'd become really, really good at it. Their entire evolutionary toolkit was built around staying hidden, eating whatever was available, and reproducing quickly enough to replace losses from predation. These are excellent survival strategies when you're living in the shadow of T-Rex. But they're not necessarily the best foundation for building a new world order. The first major challenge was simply learning how to exist in open spaces. For millions of years, mammalian life had been largely nocturnal, subterranean, or hidden in dense vegetation. The idea of wandering around in broad daylight, where anything could see you, was evolutionarily terrifying. But with the major predators gone, daylight became less of a death sentence and more of an opportunity. This shift from nocturnal to diurnal living had consequences that rippled through every aspect of mammalian biology. Eyes that had been optimized for low light conditions began to adapt to full-spectrum daylight. Color vision became more important. Social behaviors that had been limited to brief, secretive encounters could now develop into more complex interactions. The world was becoming a more visible place, and mammals were learning to live visibly. But visibility brought its own problems. Without the dense forest canopy that had provided cover during the Mesozoic, mammals had to develop new strategies for avoiding danger. Some grew larger, reasoning that size itself could be a form of protection. Others became faster, developing longer limbs and more efficient gaits. Still others doubled down on their ancestral strategy of hiding. But now they had to hide in a more open world. The plant life they depended on was going through its own dramatic transformation. The impact had been particularly devastating to forest ecosystems, but it had also created opportunities for new types of vegetation to flourish. The boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods marks not just the end of the dinosaurs, but also a fundamental shift in how plants organized themselves across the landscape. In the immediate aftermath, the surviving vegetation was dominated by what ecologists call pioneer species. These are plants that specialize in colonizing disturbed ground, growing quickly in harsh conditions, and preparing the soil for more complex plant communities to follow. Think of them as nature's first responders, showing up wherever there's been a disaster and beginning the slow work of ecological reconstruction. Among these pioneers, flowering plants had a significant advantage. Unlike the conifers and ferns that had dominated Mesozoic forests, flowering plants could reproduce relatively quickly and disperse their seeds more effectively. They were also more efficient at photosynthesis under the challenging conditions that followed the impact. As a result, they began to expand their influence across the recovering landscape. This plant revolution created new opportunities for the mammals that fed on them. Fruits, nuts, and seeds became more abundant and more diverse. But taking advantage of these new food sources required new adaptations. Mammals began developing more specialized teeth for processing plant materials, more complex digestive systems for extracting nutrients from fibrous vegetation, and new behavioral strategies for finding and harvesting plant foods. The relationship between mammals and flowering plants became one of the great evolutionary partnerships of the Cenozoic era. plants developed better ways to attract mammalian dispersers, offering nutritious fruits in exchange for seed transport. Mammals developed better ways to locate and process plant foods, evolving improved senses of smell and taste, as well as more sophisticated foraging behaviors. But this wasn't just about food. The changing vegetation also created new types of physical environments. As forests began to recover, they developed more complex vertical structures than their Mesozoic predecessors. Instead of the relatively simple canopy arrangements of conifer forests, the new angiosperm-dominated ecosystems created multiple layers of vegetation, each offering different opportunities for different species. Some mammals remained committed to ground-dwelling lifestyles, but others began to explore the three-dimensional world of the recovering forests. This vertical expansion of mammalian life required new adaptations for climbing, balancing, and navigating through complex arboreal environments. Limbs became more flexible, digits more grasping, and sensory systems more attuned to the challenges of life in the trees. The early pioneers of arboreal life weren't particularly impressive by modern standards. They were small, somewhat clumsy, and probably spent as much time falling out of trees as successfully navigating them. But they were pioneers nonetheless, exploring ecological territories that had been largely closed to mammals during the age of dinosaurs. This vertical expansion had profound implications for mammalian evolution. Living in trees required new types of sensory processing, particularly enhanced depth perception and spatial awareness. It also favored the development of more sophisticated motor control and the ability to make split-second decisions about movement and balance. These cognitive demands would eventually contribute to the evolution of larger, more complex brains. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the early Paleocene, these developments were still millions of years in the future. The mammals of this period were still very much in the experimental phase, trying out different strategies and seeing what worked in their transformed world. One of the most significant changes was in body size. During the Mesozoic, mammalian body size had been severely constrained by the presence of dinosaurs. Most mammals were small, not because small was necessarily optimal, but because anything larger tended to attract unwanted attention from predators. With the dinosaurs gone, these constraints were lifted, and mammals began to experiment with larger body sizes. This experimentation wasn't random. Larger body size offered several advantages in the post-extinction world. It provided better protection from the remaining predators, improved thermoregulation in the cooler post-impact climate, and allowed for more efficient processing of lower-quality plant foods. But it also came with costs, including increased food requirements, slower reproduction, and reduced ability to hide from danger. The mammals that successfully transitioned to larger body sizes were those that could balance these trade-offs effectively. They needed to be large enough to gain the benefits of size, but not so large that they couldn't find enough food or reproduce quickly enough to maintain their populations. This balancing act would become a recurring theme in mammalian evolution. As body sizes increased, so did the diversity of ecological roles that mammals could fill. Some became specialized herbivores, developing the complex digestive systems needed to process tough plant materials. Others became carnivores, taking advantage of the growing populations of herbivorous mammals. Still others remained omnivores, maintaining the dietary flexibility that had served their ancestors so well during the extinction event. The diversification of mammalian diets had cascading effects throughout the recovering ecosystems. As mammals began to fill different ecological niches, they created new selective pressures for other organisms. Plants developed new defenses against mammalian herbivores. Prey species evolved new strategies for avoiding mammalian predators. The entire web of ecological relationships was being rewoven from the ground up. But perhaps the most significant change was in the tempo of mammalian evolution itself. During the Mesozoic, mammalian evolution had been relatively slow and constrained. With the dinosaurs gone, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. New species appeared, diversified, and sometimes went extinct within relatively short geological time frames. Evolution was no longer just about incremental improvements. It was about rapid exploration of new possibilities. This acceleration was driven partly by the empty ecological landscape left by the dinosaur extinction, but also by the unstable environmental conditions of the early Paleocene. Climate was still fluctuating in response to the impact event. Ecosystems were still recovering and reorganizing. In such a dynamic environment, the ability to evolve quickly became a significant advantage. The mammals that thrived during this period were those that could adapt rapidly to changing conditions. They were generalists rather than specialists, opportunists rather than perfectionists. They were the biological equivalent of entrepreneurs, willing to try new strategies and pivot quickly when circumstances changed. As we move deeper into the Paleocene, we'll see how these early experiments in mammalian diversity laid the groundwork for the explosive radiation that would follow. We'll watch as mammals continued to grow larger, more diverse, and more ecologically significant. We'll see how their success began to reshape the very structure of terrestrial ecosystems. But for now, in these early millions of years after the extinction, the mammals were still very much works in progress. They were survivors who had inherited a broken world and were slowly, carefully, experimentally figuring out how to fix it. They were writing the first chapters of a story that would eventually lead to the rise of grasslands, the evolution of complex social behaviors, and ultimately, the emergence of intelligence itself. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. But first, life had to learn how to live again in a world without dinosaurs. And that, as it turned out, was just the beginning of the story. The silence that followed the great dying wasn't empty. It was full of potential, crackling with the kind of quiet energy that comes before something unprecedented happens. And what happened next would redefine not just how life worked on Earth, but how it thought about working. In the recovering landscapes of the early Paleocene, something remarkable was beginning to unfold. The mammals that had survived the apocalypse weren't content to simply replace what had been lost. They were inventing entirely new ways of being alive. And nowhere was this more evident than in how they began to approach the fundamental challenge of staying fed in a world that had forgotten its own recipes for abundance. The old food webs were gone. The carefully balanced predator-prey relationships that had sustained Mesozoic ecosystems for millions of years had vanished overnight. What remained was a biological free-for-all where the rules of who eats what were being rewritten in real time. And the mammals, with their metabolic flexibility and behavioral adaptability, were perfectly positioned to take advantage of this chaos. But advantage is a relative term. The early Paleocene was not a time of plenty. The plant communities that were struggling to reestablish themselves were often sparse, seasonally unreliable, and nutritionally poor compared to their Mesozoic predecessors. The mammals that wanted to grow beyond their ancestral rat-sized proportions needed to solve a fundamental equation. How do you get enough calories to support a larger body when the world around you is still figuring out how to make calories in the first place? The answer came in the form of evolutionary innovation on a scale that would have been impossible during the dinosaur-dominated world of the Mesozoic. With the major ecological niches vacant, mammals began experimenting with biological solutions that had never been tried before. They started developing new types of teeth, new digestive strategies, and new behaviors that would allow them to extract energy from food sources that had previously been unusable. One of the most significant developments was the evolution of more sophisticated plant processing abilities. The flowering plants that were beginning to dominate the recovering landscapes offered abundant food, but much of it was locked away in forms that required specialized equipment to access. Tough leaves, fibrous stems, and hard seeds all contained valuable nutrients, but only for animals that could break them down effectively. Mammals began developing high-crowned teeth that could grind through tough plant material without wearing down too quickly. They evolved more complex jaw muscles that could generate the sustained pressure needed for thorough chewing. Some species developed enlarged gut chambers, where bacteria could ferment plant materials that were too tough for mammalian enzymes to handle alone. These weren't minor tweaks to existing systems. They were fundamental reimaginings of how a mammalian digestive system could work. And they opened up entirely new ecological possibilities. Mammals that could efficiently process plant materials could support larger body sizes, occupy territories that had been previously uninhabitable, and maintain populations in environments where more specialized feeders would starve. But plant eating was just one part of the story. The growing populations of herbivorous mammals created new opportunities for predators. And here, too, evolution got creative. The carnivorous mammals of the early Paleocene weren't just scaled-up versions of their Mesozoic ancestors. They were entirely new experiments in what it meant to be a predator. Some developed the powerful jaws and bone-crushing teeth needed to take down the increasingly large herbivores. Others specialized in pack hunting, using coordination and persistence to bring down prey that would have been impossible for a single individual to handle. Still others became scavengers, developing the digestive systems needed to safely process carrion and the sensory equipment needed to locate it efficiently. The arms race between predators and prey drove innovation on both sides. Herbivores developed new strategies for detecting and avoiding predators, from enhanced senses to defensive behaviors to simple speed. Predators responded with better hunting techniques, improved sensory abilities, and more effective weapons. The result was an escalating cycle of evolutionary innovation that pushed both groups toward increasing sophistication. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of omnivory as a dominant mammalian strategy. The uncertain and fluctuating conditions of the early Paleocene favored animals that could eat whatever was available, whenever it was available. Mammals that could switch between plant and animal foods as circumstances dictated had a significant advantage over more specialized feeders. This dietary flexibility required its own set of adaptations. Omnivorous mammals needed teeth that could handle both plant and animal materials. They needed digestive systems that could process a wide variety of food types. And they needed the behavioral flexibility to locate and exploit different food sources as they became available. The evolution of omnivory had profound implications for mammalian intelligence. Animals that need to locate and process diverse food sources face more complex cognitive challenges than specialists. They need to remember where different types of food can be found, when they're likely to be available, and how to process them effectively. This cognitive complexity would eventually contribute to the evolution of larger, more sophisticated brains. As these dietary innovations spread through mammalian populations, they began to reshape the structure of entire ecosystems. The efficient plant processors started having significant impacts on vegetation patterns. The new predators began influencing the behavior and distribution of their prey. The omnivores became ecological connectors, moving nutrients and energy between different parts of the food web. The pace of these changes was unprecedented in mammalian evolutionary history. Species that had taken millions of years to evolve minor modifications during the Mesozoic were now undergoing major transformations in hundreds of thousands of years. The evolutionary constraints that had limited mammalian diversity for so long were gone, and life was responding with explosive creativity. But this rapid evolution came with costs. Many of the early Paleocene mammalian experiments were evolutionary dead ends. Species would evolve extreme specializations that worked well in specific circumstances, only to go extinct when those circumstances changed. The fossil record from this period is littered with the remains of mammals that tried interesting approaches to survival, but couldn't maintain them long enough to establish lasting lineages. The survivors were those that maintained enough flexibility to adapt to changing conditions while still being specialized enough to compete effectively in their chosen niches. They were the mammals that found the sweet spot between innovation and stability, between experimentation and reliability. As we move deeper into the Paleocene, we'll see how these early dietary innovations laid the groundwork for even more dramatic changes. The mammals that successfully solved the calorie equation would go on to explore new habitats, develop new behaviors, and ultimately reshape the very structure of terrestrial life. But they would also face new challenges as their success began to attract the attention of other evolving lineages. The world was becoming more crowded, more competitive, and more complex. The easy days of the immediate post-extinction period were ending, and the mammals were about to discover that survival in their new world would require more than just being in the right place at the right time. It would require genuine innovation, sophisticated strategies, and the kind of biological creativity that only emerges when life is pushed to its limits. The stage was set for the next phase of mammalian evolution, where dietary innovation would give way to locomotory experimentation, where ground dwelling would expand into arboreal exploration, and where the simple challenge of finding enough food would evolve into the complex challenge of navigating an increasingly three-dimensional world. But first, these early mammals had to finish the work of establishing themselves as the new rulers of the terrestrial realm. They had to prove that their innovations were more than just temporary solutions to post-apocalyptic problems. They had to demonstrate that they could build something lasting, something that could serve as the foundation for the extraordinary diversity of mammalian life that would follow. The early Paleocene was ending, but the story of mammalian innovation was just beginning. And what came next would be even more remarkable than what had come before. The warming world of the Middle Paleocene was becoming a very different place from the ash-covered wasteland that had emerged from the extinction event. By around 60 million years ago, Earth was settling into a rhythm that would have been familiar to anyone who had lived through a long convalescence. The patient was recovering, but the recovery was revealing just how much had fundamentally changed. The climate was stabilizing, but it was stabilizing into something unprecedented. Global temperatures were rising to levels that would make the modern world seem positively frigid. There were no ice caps at the poles. Palm trees grew in what would one day be Alaska. Crocodiles basked in rivers that flowed through regions that are now frozen tundra. This wasn't just a warm period. It was a greenhouse world operating at full capacity. For the mammals that had spent the early Paleocene learning to live in a broken world, this warming trend presented both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the warm, humid conditions were perfect for the kind of lush vegetation that could support larger, more diverse mammalian populations. On the other hand, this new climate was pushing life in directions that no mammal had ever experienced before. The forests that began to emerge in this greenhouse world were unlike anything that had existed during the Mesozoic. They were dense, multi-layered jungles that stretched from the equator nearly to the poles. These weren't the relatively simple conifer forests that had dominated the age of dinosaurs. These were complex, three-dimensional ecosystems where life was organized in vertical layers, each with its own microclimate, its own food sources, and its own evolutionary pressures. For mammals, this vertical complexity represented a completely new frontier. During the Mesozoic, mammalian life had been largely two-dimensional, confined to the ground and the occasional low shrub. But the towering forests of the Middle Paleocene offered a three-dimensional world of unprecedented complexity, and some mammals began to wonder what it would be like to live up there. The first mammalian experiments with arboreal life were tentative and somewhat clumsy. These early tree dwellers were essentially ground-dwelling mammals that had learned to climb. They retained most of their terrestrial adaptations while gradually developing the modifications needed for life in the trees. Longer digits for gripping branches, more flexible joints for navigating complex three-dimensional spaces, enhanced balance and coordination for moving through an environment where a single misstep could be fatal. But climbing trees was just the beginning. The mammals that successfully colonized the arboreal realm discovered that life in the trees required entirely different strategies than life on the ground. Food sources were distributed differently. Predators approached from different angles. Social interactions took on new dimensions when you could literally look down on your neighbors. Perhaps most significantly, life in the trees demanded new types of sensory processing. Ground-dwelling mammals could rely heavily on scent and hearing to navigate their world. But in the complex, shifting environment of the forest canopy, vision became paramount. The ability to judge distances accurately, to detect movement in dappled light, to distinguish between stable and unstable surfaces, all became matters of life and death. The mammals that thrived in this new arboreal world were those that could integrate visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information in real time. They needed to be able to process spatial relationships quickly and accurately. They needed to be able to make split-second decisions about movement and balance. And they needed to be able to do all of this while simultaneously searching for food, avoiding predators, and interacting with other members of their species. These cognitive demands began to drive the evolution of larger, more complex brains. The mammals that were successfully exploiting the arboreal realm weren't just physically different from their ground-dwelling ancestors. They were neurologically different. They were developing enhanced spatial processing abilities, improved hand-eye coordination, and more sophisticated motor control systems. But the influence of the arboreal realm extended beyond individual species. The three-dimensional complexity of the forest canopy created new opportunities for ecological specialization. Different layers of the forest offered different types of food, different microclimates, and different challenges. Some mammals specialized in life in the emergent layer where tall trees broke through the main canopy. Others focused on the dense middle canopy, where most of the forest's biomass was concentrated. Still others carved out niches in the understory, where limited light created unique conditions for both plants and animals. This vertical stratification of mammalian life had profound implications for evolution. Populations that occupied different layers of the forest were subject to different selective pressures. Over time, this led to the evolution of distinct adaptations for different arboreal niches. Some mammals developed the long limbs and powerful muscles needed for rapid movement through the upper canopy. Others evolved the enhanced grip strength and careful movement patterns needed for life on thin branches. Still others specialized in the patient, methodical exploration of the dense middle canopy. The result was an explosion of mammalian diversity that was unprecedented in Earth's history. Species were evolving and diversifying at rates that would have been impossible during the dinosaur-dominated Mesozoic. The empty ecological landscape left by the extinction was being filled not just with new species, but with entirely new types of organisms that had never existed before. But this rapid diversification came with its own challenges. The warm, humid conditions that made the arboreal realm so productive also made it unstable. Weather patterns were unpredictable, seasonal variations were extreme, and the lush vegetation that supported the complex food webs was itself subject to dramatic fluctuations. The mammals that succeeded in this volatile environment were those that maintained the flexibility that had served their ancestors so well during the extinction event. They were generalists rather than narrow specialists. They were opportunists who could adjust their strategies as conditions changed. They were the biological equivalent of entrepreneurs, constantly exploring new possibilities and adapting to new circumstances. As these arboreal mammals continued to evolve and diversify, they began to develop new types of behaviors that would have been impossible in the simpler environments of the Mesozoic. The complex three-dimensional structure of the forest canopy created opportunities for sophisticated social interactions. Mammals could establish territories that were defined not just by ground area, but by specific layers of the forest. They could communicate across distances using the acoustic properties of the forest canopy. They could engage in complex, competitive, and cooperative behaviors that took advantage of the vertical structure of their environment. Some species began to develop primitive forms of tool use, using sticks and stones to extract insects from bark or to process food items. Others evolved complex social hierarchies that were maintained through sophisticated communication systems. Still others developed the ability to modify their environment in small but significant ways, creating nesting sites or food storage areas that enhanced their survival prospects. These behavioral innovations were driven by the same cognitive demands that were shaping mammalian brain evolution. The complex, three-dimensional world of the forest canopy required new types of problem-solving abilities. Mammals needed to be able to plan ahead, to remember the locations of food sources and potential dangers, to coordinate their activities with other members of their species. They needed to be able to learn from experience and to modify their behavior based on changing circumstances. The mammals that were most successful in developing these cognitive abilities were those that invested heavily in brain development. They were species that could afford to have longer developmental periods during which young animals could learn the complex skills needed for arboreal life. They were species that could support the metabolic costs of larger brains through efficient foraging strategies and productive food sources. As we move deeper into the Paleocene, we'll see how these early experiments in arboreal life laid the groundwork for even more dramatic evolutionary developments. The mammals that successfully colonized the three-dimensional world of the forest canopy were developing the physical and cognitive tools that would eventually lead to the evolution of sophisticated social behaviors, complex communication systems, and ultimately, the emergence of intelligence itself. But they were also setting the stage for new types of ecological interactions. The success of arboreal mammals was beginning to influence the evolution of the plants they depended on. Trees and shrubs began to develop new strategies for attracting mammalian dispersers and pollinators. Fruits became more nutritious and more conspicuous. Flowers evolved new colors and scents that appealed to mammalian senses. Seeds developed new mechanisms for surviving passage through mammalian digestive systems. This coevolution between mammals and plants was creating feedback loops that drove innovation on both sides. Plants that could better attract and reward mammalian partners had access to more effective seed dispersal and pollination services. Mammals that could better locate and process plant resources had access to more reliable food sources. The result was an escalating cycle of evolutionary innovation that was transforming both the structure and function of forest ecosystems. The warm, humid world of the Middle Paleocene was becoming a biological laboratory where life was experimenting with possibilities that had never existed before. The mammals that were exploring these possibilities were no longer just survivors of the great extinction. They were pioneers of a new type of life, one that was more complex, more sophisticated, and more cognitively demanding than anything that had come before. But this was still just the beginning. The innovations that were emerging in the arboreal realm would eventually spread to other environments and other lineages. The cognitive abilities that were being developed in the forest canopy would eventually be applied to new challenges and new opportunities. And the mammals that were learning to live in 3 dimensions would eventually discover that their world had even more dimensions to explore. The stage was set for the next phase of mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned in the trees would be applied to new environments, new challenges, and new opportunities, where the cognitive abilities developed for navigating the forest canopy would be redirected toward social interaction, environmental manipulation, and ultimately the development of culture itself. But first, these arboreal pioneers had to continue the work of establishing themselves in their 3-dimensional world. They had to prove that their innovations were more than just temporary adaptations to unusual circumstances. They had to demonstrate that they could build something lasting, something that could serve as the foundation for the extraordinary diversity of mammalian life that would eventually emerge from the forests and spread across the globe. The Middle Paleocene was ending, but the story of mammalian innovation was entering a new and even more remarkable phase. And what came next would challenge our understanding of what it means to be intelligent, social, and ultimately human. The transformation that was brewing in the world's forests during the late Paleocene wasn't just about mammals learning to live in trees. It was about life itself, discovering new ways to think, new ways to process information, and new ways to solve problems that had never existed before. And at the center of this cognitive revolution was a group of small, seemingly unremarkable mammals that would eventually change everything. These early primates didn't look like much. Most were no bigger than a modern squirrel, with large eyes adapted for life in the dim forest understory, grasping hands that could wrap around thin branches, and brains that were just beginning to tackle the complex challenges of 3-dimensional living. They weren't the first mammals to climb trees, but they were among the first to make the forest canopy their permanent home. And that decision would have consequences that rippled through the next 50 million years of evolutionary history. What made these early primates different wasn't their size or their strength. It was their approach to the fundamental problem of staying alive in a world where every movement required split-second calculations about distance, balance, and the reliability of your next handhold. While other mammals were solving the challenges of arboreal life through improved physical equipment, stronger claws, better balance, more flexible joints, the primates were developing something entirely different. Better brains. This wasn't a conscious choice, of course. Evolution doesn't make decisions about what would be useful in the future. But the complex, ever-changing environment of the forest canopy created selective pressures that favored animals with enhanced cognitive abilities. The primates that could judge distances more accurately, remember the locations of food sources more reliably, and coordinate their movements more precisely were the ones that survived and reproduced. Over thousands of generations, these advantages accumulated into something unprecedented. Mammals that were genuinely intelligent. The development of primate intelligence wasn't a single breakthrough. It was a gradual process that unfolded over millions of years, driven by the relentless demands of arboreal life. The forest canopy was a world of constant decision-making, where every leap from branch to branch required the integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. The primates that thrived in this environment were those that could process this information quickly and accurately, making the kinds of split-second judgments that meant the difference between a successful jump and a fatal fall. But intelligence is expensive. Brain tissue requires enormous amounts of energy to maintain, and the early primates had to solve the fundamental problem of how to fuel their increasingly sophisticated neural machinery. The answer came in the form of a new type of diet that took advantage of the forest's most concentrated energy sources, fruits, young leaves, and insects. These foods were nutritious enough to support the metabolic demands of larger brains, but they were also patchy and unpredictable, requiring sophisticated foraging strategies to locate and exploit effectively. The primates that successfully made this transition weren't just physically different from their ancestors. They were behaviorally different. They began to develop new types of social behaviors, new ways of communicating with each other, and new strategies for sharing information about food sources and potential dangers. The forest canopy became not just a physical environment, but a social environment where success depended as much on your ability to interact with other primates as on your ability to navigate through the trees. This social dimension of primate evolution was crucial. The challenges of arboreal life weren't just individual challenges, they were group challenges. Primates that could coordinate their movements, share information about food sources, and work together to avoid predators had significant advantages over those that tried to go it alone. The result was the evolution of increasingly sophisticated social behaviors that required new types of cognitive abilities. The primates were learning to read each other's intentions, to anticipate each other's actions, and to coordinate their behavior in ways that would have been impossible for their solitary ancestors. They were developing the ability to understand not just their physical environment, but their social environment as well. They were becoming, in essence, the first truly social mammals. But this social evolution came with its own challenges. Living in groups required new types of behavioral flexibility. Primates had to learn to balance competition with cooperation, to establish and maintain social hierarchies, and to navigate the complex web of relationships that defined group life. They had to develop new ways of communicating that could convey not just information about the external world, but information about their internal states, their intentions, their emotions, their social relationships. The primates that succeeded in this social environment were those that could master what would later be called the social brain. They were animals that could remember who they had interacted with, how those interactions had gone, and what those relationships meant for future behavior. They were developing the cognitive foundations for empathy, cooperation, and ultimately, culture itself. As these early primates continued to evolve and diversify, they began to explore new regions beyond their original forest homes. The warm, humid conditions of the late Paleocene had created forest corridors that stretched across continents, allowing primates to spread from their origins in what would later become North America and Europe into Asia and eventually Africa. Each new environment presented new challenges and new opportunities for evolutionary innovation. The primates that colonized these new regions weren't just passive migrants. They were active explorers, using their enhanced cognitive abilities to assess new environments, locate new food sources, and establish new social groups. They were pioneers in the truest sense, pushing the boundaries of what was possible for mammalian life, and establishing the foundations for the extraordinary diversity of primate species that would eventually emerge. But even as they spread across the globe, these early primates remained fundamentally arboreal creatures. Their bodies, their brains, and their behaviors were all shaped by the demands of life in the trees. They were specialists in three-dimensional navigation, experts in the art of moving through complex vertical environments, and masters of the social dynamics that defined group life in the forest canopy. The world they inhabited was unlike anything that exists today. The greenhouse conditions of the late Paleocene had created forests that were more extensive, more productive, and more diverse than any that would follow. These were ecosystems where the normal rules of ecological competition had been suspended, where there was enough abundance to support the kinds of experimental lifestyles that would have been impossible under more restrictive conditions. The primates were taking full advantage of this abundance. They were diversifying into new species at rates that would have been impossible during the more constrained conditions of the Mesozoic. Some were specializing in different types of food, developing new digestive strategies and new foraging behaviors. Others were exploring different layers of the forest, adapting to the unique conditions found in the emergent layer, the main canopy, or the understory. Still others were experimenting with different social systems, from solitary foragers to complex multi-male, multi-female groups. Each of these social experiments required new types of cognitive abilities, new ways of processing social information, and new strategies for maintaining group cohesion in the face of individual competition. The result was an explosion of primate diversity that laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The cognitive abilities that were being developed in the late Paleocene forests would eventually be applied to new challenges and new environments. The social behaviors that were emerging in these early primate groups would eventually evolve into the complex cultural systems that define human societies. And the physical adaptations that were being refined in the forest canopy would eventually be modified for life in new environments, from grasslands to mountains to, eventually, the ground itself. But all of this was still millions of years in the future. In the late Paleocene, the primates were still very much creatures of the trees, still very much products of the unique conditions that had emerged in the aftermath of the Great Extinction. They were successful, they were innovative, and they were establishing the foundations for future evolutionary radiations. But they were also vulnerable to the kinds of environmental changes that could disrupt their forest homes and challenge their arboreal adaptations. The greenhouse world of the late Paleocene was not destined to last forever. Climate systems are inherently unstable, and the extreme conditions that had created such favorable environments for primate evolution were already beginning to show signs of change. The primates that had flourished in the warm, humid forests of the late Paleocene would soon face new challenges that would test their adaptability and drive new phases of evolutionary innovation. But they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had demonstrated that mammals could be more than just efficient biological machines. They could be intelligent, social, and creative. They could solve problems, form relationships, and adapt to new circumstances with a flexibility that had never been seen before in the history of life on Earth. The stage was set for the next phase of mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned in the trees would be applied to new environments and new challenges, where the cognitive abilities developed for navigating the forest canopy would be redirected toward new types of problem solving, and where the social behaviors that had emerged in primate groups would evolve into something even more sophisticated and complex. The late Paleocene was ending, but the story of mammalian intelligence was just beginning, and what came next would be even more remarkable than what had come before. The transition from the Paleocene to the Eocene, around 56 million years ago, marked more than just a change in geological time periods. It marked the beginning of what would later be recognized as one of the most dramatic climate events in Earth's history, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. In the span of just a few thousand years, global temperatures spiked by as much as 8 degrees Celsius, turning an already warm world into something that resembled a planetary fever dream. For the mammals that had spent the Paleocene learning to live in forest canopies, this sudden warming created both opportunities and challenges on an unprecedented scale. The PETM, as scientists would later call it, wasn't just a warm period. It was a reorganization of how Earth's climate system functioned. Ocean currents shifted, precipitation patterns changed, and the very chemistry of the atmosphere was altered in ways that would influence the evolution of life for millions of years to come. The forests that had provided such rich environments for early mammalian evolution began to expand even further toward the poles. Palm trees grew in what would one day be the Arctic. Tropical conditions extended well into what are now temperate regions. And in this superheated world, life exploded with a creativity and diversity that would have been impossible under more constrained conditions. But this explosion of life wasn't uniform. The extreme conditions of the P.E. created winner and losers, and the mammals that had invested heavily in arboreal adaptations found themselves in an evolutionary sweet spot. The expanded forests provided more habitat, more food sources, and more opportunities for the kinds of complex social behaviors that had been developing throughout the Paleocene. The primates, in particular, found themselves in a world that seemed almost designed for their success. The warm, humid conditions created forest ecosystems that were more productive and more structurally complex than anything that had existed before. The trees grew taller, the canopies became denser, and the vertical stratification of forest life became more pronounced. For mammals that had evolved to exploit three-dimensional environments, this was paradise. But the PRTM also created new challenges. The rapid warming disrupted established ecological relationships and forced rapid evolutionary responses. Species that had been successful under the cooler conditions of the Paleocene suddenly found themselves struggling to adapt to the new thermal regime. The mammals that survived and thrived were those that could adjust their physiology, their behavior, and their ecological relationships quickly enough to keep pace with the changing environment. The primates proved to be particularly adept at this kind of rapid adaptation. Their enhanced cognitive abilities allowed them to adjust their behaviors in real time as environmental conditions changed. Their flexible social systems allowed them to reorganize their group structures as resource availability shifted, and their generalist diets allowed them to exploit new food sources as they became available. The result was a primate radiation that was unprecedented in its scope and diversity. New species appeared, diversified, and spread across the expanded forest ecosystems at rates that would have been impossible under more stable conditions. Some specialized in different types of food, developing new digestive strategies and new foraging behaviors. Others explored different layers of the increasingly complex forest canopy, adapting to the unique conditions found at different heights. Still others began to experiment with different activity patterns, taking advantage of the extended daylight hours that were available in the expanded tropical zones. The transition from nocturnal to diurnal activity patterns was a crucial development that would have profound implications for primate evolution. Animals that were active during the day could rely more heavily on vision than on scent or hearing, leading to the evolution of enhanced visual processing abilities and more sophisticated spatial cognition. The primates that made this transition weren't just changing when they were active, they were changing how they perceived and interacted with their world. Daytime activity patterns favored the development of color vision, enhanced depth perception, and more sophisticated visual motor coordination. These abilities, in turn, supported the evolution of more complex foraging behaviors, more sophisticated social interactions, and more nuanced communication systems. The PETM also created new opportunities for mammalian gigantism. The abundant food sources and favorable climatic conditions allowed some mammalian lineages to experiment with much larger body sizes than had been possible during the Paleocene. While most mammals remained relatively small, some began to explore the ecological niches that had been vacated by the dinosaurs millions of years earlier. These early experiments in mammalian gigantism weren't particularly successful in the long term, but they demonstrated the kind of evolutionary flexibility that would characterize mammalian evolution throughout the Cenozoic. The mammals that had started as small secretive creatures hiding from dinosaurs were now confident enough to try occupying the same ecological roles that the dinosaurs had once filled. But perhaps the most significant development during the PETM was the emergence of new types of ecological relationships between mammals and other organisms. The expanded forests created opportunities for new types of plant-animal interactions, new forms of symbiosis, and new patterns of coevolution that would shape the structure of terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years to come. The primates, with their enhanced cognitive abilities and their flexible social systems, were particularly well positioned to take advantage of these new ecological opportunities. They began to develop more sophisticated relationships with the plants they depended on, not just as consumers of fruits and leaves, but as partners in seed dispersal and pollination. They became mobile links in the forest ecosystem, connecting different areas of the forest and facilitating the flow of genetic material between plant populations. This role as ecosystem engineers had profound implications for primate evolution. The primates that were most effective at facilitating plant reproduction had access to the most reliable food sources. The plants that were most effective at attracting primate partners had access to the most efficient dispersal services. The result was a co-evolutionary arms race that drove innovation on both sides and created increasingly sophisticated ecological relationships. The primates were also beginning to develop new types of relationships with other mammals. The expanded forests supported more diverse mammalian communities, creating opportunities for new forms of interspecific interaction. Some primates began to develop commensalistic relationships with other species, following mixed species foraging groups and taking advantage of the enhanced predator detection and foraging efficiency that came with group living. Others began to develop more complex competitive relationships, leading to the evolution of new types of territorial behaviors and more sophisticated strategies for resource defense. The primates that were most successful in these competitive environments were those that could balance aggression with cooperation, competition with collaboration, and individual success with group cohesion. As the PETM reached its peak, the mammalian communities that had emerged from the post-extinction recovery were becoming increasingly complex and sophisticated. The primates, in particular, had evolved from simple arboreal generalists into a diverse array of species with specialized adaptations for different ecological niches. different social systems and different cognitive challenges. But this period of rapid diversification and ecological experimentation was not destined to last forever. The extreme conditions that had created such favorable environments for mammalian evolution were already beginning to show signs of instability. The greenhouse world of the early Eocene was approaching its limits, and the mammals that had flourished under these conditions would soon face new challenges that would test their adaptability and drive new phases of evolutionary innovation. The stage was set for the next chapter in the story of mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned during the Permian would be applied to new environmental challenges and new ecological opportunities, where the cognitive abilities that had been developed in the expanded forests would be tested against new types of problems and new forms of environmental uncertainty. But first, the mammals of the early Eocene had to continue the work of establishing themselves in their superheated world. They had to prove that their innovations were more than just temporary responses to unusual conditions. They had to demonstrate that they could build something lasting, something that could serve as the foundation for the extraordinary diversity of mammalian life that would eventually emerge from the forests and spread across the globe. The early Eocene was a time of unprecedented opportunity for mammalian evolution, but it was also a time of unprecedented challenge, where success required not just the ability to adapt to new conditions, but the ability to shape those conditions in ways that would support continued evolutionary innovation. The mammals that rose to meet these challenges would lay the groundwork for everything that followed. They would establish the patterns of ecological interaction, the forms of social organization, and the types of cognitive abilities that would define mammalian evolution for the next 50 million years. And they would do so in a world that was more dynamic, more complex, and more demanding than anything that had existed before in the history of life on Earth. The world that emerged from the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was a testament to life's ability to not just survive extreme conditions, but to transform them into opportunities for unprecedented innovation. By around 50 million years ago, the mammals that had spent millions of years learning to live in an empty world suddenly found themselves in a world that was almost too full, too productive, too alive for its own good. The forests that stretched from pole to pole weren't just bigger versions of what had come before. They were fundamentally different ecosystems, layered with a complexity that challenged every assumption about how life could organize itself. In the steamy, carbon-rich atmosphere of the early Eocene, plants grew with an exuberance that bordered on the ridiculous. Trees reached heights that would have been impossible under normal atmospheric conditions. Vines created three-dimensional webs that connected forest layers in ways that turned the entire ecosystem into a single, interconnected organism. And in this biological paradise, the mammals that had started as small, cautious survivors were beginning to discover what it meant to live without limits. The constraints that had shaped mammalian evolution for millions of years, the need to stay small, to stay hidden, to stay simple, were dissolving in the face of unlimited opportunity. For the first time in their evolutionary history, mammals could dream big, and some of them did. The megafauna that began to emerge during this period weren't just large mammals. They were experiments in what mammalian life could become when freed from the usual constraints of size, diet, and lifestyle. Some grew to dimensions that rivaled the dinosaurs that had once ruled the earth. Others developed bizarre anatomical features that seemed to serve no obvious purpose other than to explore the outer limits of what was biologically possible. These giants weren't evolutionary mistakes. They were testaments to the creative power of life when given unlimited resources and unlimited time. They were proof that evolution doesn't just solve problems, it explores possibilities. And in the greenhouse world of the early Eocene, the possibilities seemed endless. But size was just one dimension of the mammalian explosion that was unfolding. The real innovation was happening at the level of behavior, cognition, and social organization. The mammals that were thriving in this new world weren't just bigger than their ancestors. They were smarter, more social, and more capable of complex interactions with both their environment and each other. The primates, in particular, were pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be intelligent. The cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating the forest canopy were being applied to new challenges and new opportunities. Some species were beginning to use tools, not just as occasional conveniences, but as regular parts of their behavioral repertoire. Others were developing communication systems that went beyond simple alarm calls to include complex information about food sources, social relationships, and environmental conditions. The social systems that were emerging in these early Eocene primate communities were unlike anything that had existed before in mammalian evolution. Groups were larger, more stable, and more hierarchically organized than their Paleocene predecessors. The primates were learning to navigate not just the physical complexity of their three-dimensional forest homes, but the social complexity of living in large, multi-generational groups with complex relationship networks. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what could only be called cultural transmission. The primates weren't just learning how to survive in their environment. They were learning how to teach others how to survive. Information about food sources, foraging techniques, and social behaviors was being passed from generation to generation in ways that went beyond simple imitation to include active instruction and feedback. This cultural dimension of primate evolution was revolutionary. For the first time in Earth's history, there were animals that could accumulate knowledge across generations, building on the discoveries of their predecessors to create increasingly sophisticated behavioral repertoires. The primates were becoming not just intelligent individuals, but intelligent societies. The implications of this development extended far beyond the primate lineage itself. The cultural transmission of information created positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of behavioral innovation. Techniques that might have taken thousands of years to evolve through genetic changes could now be developed and refined within the lifetime of a single generation. The primates were discovering that intelligence wasn't just about individual problem-solving ability. It was about collective learning and cumulative cultural evolution. As these culturally sophisticated primates continued to diversify and spread across the expanded forest ecosystems, they began to have significant impacts on the environments they inhabited. They weren't just passive inhabitants of their forest homes, they were active modifiers of forest structure and function. Their foraging behaviors influenced plant distributions. Their seed dispersal activities affected forest regeneration patterns. Their social behaviors created new types of ecological relationships that hadn't existed before. The primates were becoming ecosystem engineers, species whose activities had cascading effects throughout the ecological communities they inhabited. And this engineering role was creating new selective pressures that drove further innovation in both cognitive abilities and social behaviors. The primates that were most effective at managing their environmental relationships were those that could understand and manipulate complex ecological systems. But the primate radiation wasn't happening in isolation. The same conditions that were driving primate innovation were also creating opportunities for other mammalian lineages to explore new evolutionary directions. The expanded forests supported an unprecedented diversity of mammalian species, each exploring different solutions to the challenges and opportunities of life in the greenhouse world. Some mammals were specializing in different types of plant foods, developing new digestive strategies that allowed them to extract energy from previously inedible materials. Others were exploring new types of predatory lifestyles, developing hunting techniques that took advantage of the complex three-dimensional structure of the forest environment. Still others were experimenting with new forms of social organization, from solitary territorial systems to complex cooperative societies. The result was a mammalian community that was more diverse, more ecologically complex, and more behaviorally sophisticated than anything that had existed before. The mammals weren't just filling the ecological niches that had been vacated by the dinosaur extinction. They were creating entirely new types of ecological relationships and new ways of organizing biological communities. This explosion of mammalian diversity was being driven by more than just favorable environmental conditions. The mammals themselves were becoming agents of evolutionary change, creating new selective pressures and new opportunities for innovation through their own activities. The social behaviors that were emerging in primate communities were influencing the evolution of other species that interacted with them. The ecosystem engineering activities of various mammalian species were creating new habitats and new ecological opportunities for other organisms. The early Eocene was becoming a period of evolutionary experimentation on a scale that hadn't been seen since the Cambrian explosion. But unlike the Cambrian, where innovation was primarily driven by the evolution of new body plans and new ways of making a living, the Eocene explosion was being driven by the evolution of new ways of thinking, new ways of interacting socially, and new ways of manipulating the environment. The mammals were discovering that intelligence wasn't just a tool for individual survival. It was a force that could reshape entire ecosystems. The cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating the challenges of arboreal life were being applied to the challenges of environmental management, social coordination, and cultural transmission. The mammals weren't just adapting to their environment, they were actively shaping it. As the early Eocene reached its peak, the mammalian communities that had emerged from the post-extinction recovery were becoming increasingly complex and sophisticated. The simple predator-prey relationships that had characterized earlier ecosystems were giving way to intricate webs of interaction that included cooperation, competition, mutualism, and cultural exchange. The primates, in particular, had evolved from simple arboreal generalists into a diverse array of species with specialized adaptations for different ecological niches, different social systems, and different cognitive challenges. Some were developing enhanced visual processing abilities that allowed them to navigate the complex light environments of the forest canopy. Others were evolving more sophisticated manual dexterity that enabled them to manipulate their environment in increasingly precise ways. Still others were experimenting with different forms of social organization, from pair-bonded family groups to large multi-male societies with complex hierarchical structures. Each of these social experiments required new types of cognitive abilities, new ways of processing social information, and new strategies for maintaining group cohesion in the face of individual competition. The diversity of solutions that were emerging was testament to the creative power of evolution when freed from the usual constraints of resource limitation and environmental stability. The mammals weren't just surviving in their greenhouse world. They were thriving in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was biologically possible. But this period of unprecedented evolutionary experimentation was also creating new forms of instability. The same conditions that had enabled such rapid diversification were also creating new vulnerabilities. The mammalian communities that had emerged during the early Eocene were becoming increasingly dependent on the stable, productive conditions that had enabled their evolution. Any disruption to these conditions could have catastrophic consequences for the complex ecological relationships that had developed. The greenhouse world of the early Eocene was approaching its limits. The extreme conditions that had created such favorable environments for mammalian evolution were beginning to show signs of instability. Climate systems were becoming increasingly volatile. Ocean chemistry was shifting in ways that would affect marine ecosystems. And the very atmospheric conditions that had enabled such rapid plant growth were beginning to change. The mammals that had flourished under these conditions would soon face new challenges that would test their adaptability and drive new phases of evolutionary innovation. The cognitive abilities that had been developed in the expanded forests would be tested against new types of environmental uncertainty. The social behaviors that had emerged in stable, productive communities would be challenged by new forms of resource competition and environmental stress. The stage was set for the next chapter in the story of mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned during the greenhouse world would be applied to new environmental challenges and new ecological opportunities, where the innovations that had emerged during the period of unlimited possibility would be tested against the constraints of a changing world. But first, the mammals of the early Eocene had to continue the work of establishing themselves in their superheated world. They had to prove that their innovations were more than just temporary responses to unusual conditions. They had to demonstrate that they could build something lasting, something that could serve as the foundation for the extraordinary diversity of mammalian life that would eventually emerge from the forests and spread across the globe. The early Eocene was a time of unprecedented opportunity for mammalian evolution, but it was also a time of unprecedented challenge, where success required not just the ability to adapt to new conditions, but the ability to shape those conditions in ways that would support continued evolutionary innovation. The mammals that rose to meet these challenges would lay the groundwork for everything that followed, establishing the patterns of ecological interaction, the forms of social organization, and the types of cognitive abilities that would define mammalian evolution for the next 50 million years. And they would do so in a world that was more dynamic, more complex, and more demanding than anything that had existed before in the history of life on Earth. The greenhouse world was about to end, but the innovations it had fostered would prove to be remarkably durable, providing the foundation for mammalian success in whatever world came next. The cooling that began around 34 million years ago wasn't gradual or gentle. It was Earth's climate system slamming on the brakes after millions of years of greenhouse excess. The Eocene-Oligocene transition marked the end of the hothouse world that had nurtured such extraordinary mammalian diversity, and the beginning of something colder, drier, and far less forgiving. Antarctica, which had been green and forested throughout the Eocene, began its transformation into the frozen continent we know today. The Drake Passage opened between South America and Antarctica, creating a circumpolar current that effectively isolated the southern continent from warmer waters. Ice sheets began to form, locking up vast amounts of water and causing sea levels to drop dramatically. Global temperatures plummeted by as much as 7 degrees Celsius in some regions. For the mammals that had spent millions of years adapting to life in stable, productive forest ecosystems, this climate shift was nothing short of catastrophic. The lush, multi-layered forests that had stretched from pole to pole began to fragment and retreat. Tropical conditions that had extended well into what are now temperate regions contracted toward the equator. The three-dimensional paradise that had enabled such remarkable evolutionary experimentation was collapsing. The primates, in particular, found themselves facing an existential crisis. The arboreal lifestyle that had served them so well during the greenhouse world was suddenly becoming a liability. Forest canopies were thinning, becoming less connected, and offering fewer resources. The cognitive abilities that had been refined for navigating complex three-dimensional environments were still valuable, but they needed to be applied to new challenges in a world where the old rules no longer applied. Many primate lineages simply couldn't adapt quickly enough. The fossil record from this period tells a story of dramatic decline in primate diversity, particularly in the higher latitudes where cooling was most severe. Species that had been successful for millions of years disappeared from the record, leaving behind only fragmentary remains as evidence of their former abundance. But extinction is always paired with opportunity, and the mammals that survived the Eocene-Oligocene transition were those that could pivot quickly to exploit new ecological niches. The cooling climate and changing vegetation patterns created opportunities for mammals that had been overshadowed by the forest specialists during the greenhouse world. The most significant of these opportunities came from an unlikely source: grass. This humble plant family had been present throughout the Cenozoic, but it had remained largely confined to disturbed areas and forest edges. The cooler, drier conditions of the early Oligocene created perfect conditions for grass to expand its range dramatically, and with it came the potential for entirely new types of mammalian ecosystems. Grasslands weren't just different from forests. They were fundamentally different ecosystems with their own rules, their own challenges, and their own opportunities. In forests, most of the biomass was locked up in wood and leaves that were difficult for mammals to digest. In grasslands, the biomass was concentrated in the grass itself, which, while tough and fibrous, could be processed by mammals with the right anatomical equipment. The problem was that most mammals didn't have the right equipment. Grass is notoriously difficult to digest, loaded with silica that wears down teeth and cellulose that requires specialized gut bacteria to break down. The mammals that wanted to take advantage of this new food source needed to undergo significant anatomical and physiological changes. Some lineages began developing high-crowned teeth that could withstand the abrasive effects of grass consumption. Others evolved complex, multi-chambered stomachs that could house the bacteria needed for cellulose digestion. Still others developed new types of social behaviors that allowed them to coordinate their movements across the vast open spaces of the emerging grasslands. The ruminants were among the most successful of these grassland pioneers. These mammals had evolved a four-chambered stomach system that allowed them to extract maximum nutrition from tough plant materials through a process of fermentation and rechewing. The ruminant digestive system was essentially a portable fermentation chamber, enabling these mammals to thrive on food sources that would have been inedible to their predecessors. But the ruminants weren't just passive consumers of grass. They were active participants in the grassland ecosystem, their grazing activities helping to maintain the open conditions that grasses required. This created a positive feedback loop where the expansion of grasslands supported larger populations of grazing mammals, which in turn promoted further grassland expansion. The emergence of grassland ecosystems also created new opportunities for predators. The open conditions of grasslands favored different hunting strategies than the ambush tactics that had been common in forest environments. Cursorial predators, those specialized for running down prey in open country, began to evolve and diversify. These new predators weren't just faster versions of their forest-dwelling ancestors. They were fundamentally different animals with longer limbs, more efficient cardiovascular systems, and enhanced sensory abilities for detecting prey at a distance. The arms race between grassland herbivores and their predators drove innovation on both sides, leading to some of the most impressive examples of mammalian athleticism in the fossil record. The primates, meanwhile, were facing their own challenges in adapting to the post-greenhouse world. The cognitive abilities that had been refined in the complex three-dimensional environments of the Eocene forests were still valuable, but they needed to be applied to new problems. Some primate lineages began to spend more time on the ground, developing new locomotory strategies for moving across increasingly open landscapes. The transition from purely arboreal to semi-terrestrial lifestyles wasn't easy for mammals that had spent millions of years adapting to life in trees. Ground dwelling required different types of sensory processing, different social behaviors, and different strategies for avoiding predators. The primates that successfully made this transition were those that could maintain the cognitive flexibility that had served them so well in the trees while adapting to the new challenges of terrestrial life. Some primate populations began to develop new types of social organization that were better suited to life in more open environments. The small dispersed groups that had been optimal for forest living gave way to larger, more cohesive social units that could provide better protection against predators and more efficient exploitation of scattered food resources. The evolution of more complex social systems required new types of cognitive abilities. Primates needed to be able to track the relationships and hierarchies within larger groups, to coordinate their activities across greater distances, and to communicate more effectively about threats and opportunities. The social brain that had begun to evolve in the Eocene forests was being refined and expanded to meet these new challenges. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the emergence of new forms of environmental manipulation. The primates that were most successful in adapting to the changing conditions were those that could actively modify their environment to make it more suitable for their needs. This might involve simple behaviors like nest building or food storage, but it represented a fundamental shift in how mammals interacted with their world. The ability to modify the environment required new types of cognitive abilities, including the capacity for forward planning, the ability to understand cause and effect relationships, and the development of what would later be recognized as primitive forms of tool use. The primates weren't just adapting to their environment, they were beginning to shape it. This environmental manipulation had cascading effects throughout the ecosystems where these primates lived. Their activities influenced plant distributions, affected soil chemistry, and created new types of habitat structures that benefited other species. The primates were becoming ecosystem engineers, species whose activities had effects that extended far beyond their immediate survival needs. The transition from the greenhouse world to the icehouse world of the Oligocene was one of the most significant environmental changes in mammalian evolutionary history. It marked the end of the period of unlimited possibility that had characterized the Eocene and the beginning of a new era where success required more specialized adaptations and more sophisticated strategies for dealing with environmental constraints. The mammals that survived this transition were those that could balance specialization with flexibility, efficiency with adaptability. They were the ancestors of the modern mammalian fauna, the lineages that would go on to colonize every continent and every major habitat type. But they were also the products of one of the most challenging periods in mammalian evolutionary history, a time when the skills and strategies that had been developed during the greenhouse world were tested against the harsh realities of a cooling planet. The cooling world of the early Oligocene created new types of selective pressures that would shape mammalian evolution for millions of years to come. The cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating complex forest environments were being applied to new challenges. The social behaviors that had emerged in stable, productive communities were being tested against new forms of resource competition and environmental stress. But the mammals that had survived the greenhouse world were remarkably resilient. They had already demonstrated their ability to adapt to extreme environmental conditions, to innovate in the face of unprecedented challenges, and to create new forms of ecological relationships. The cooling world would test these abilities once again, but it would also create new opportunities for innovation and diversification. The stage was set for the next chapter in mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned during the greenhouse world would be applied to the challenges of a cooler, drier, and more variable planet, where the innovations that had emerged during the period of unlimited possibility would be refined and adapted to meet the constraints of a changing world. The mammals that rose to meet these challenges would establish the patterns of ecological interaction, the forms of social organization, and the types of cognitive abilities that would define mammalian evolution for the remainder of the Cenozoic. They would prove that the innovations of the greenhouse world were more than just temporary responses to unusual conditions. They were the foundation for a new type of mammalian life that could thrive in whatever world came next. As the early Oligocene progressed, the mammals that had inherited the cooling Earth were discovering that survival required more than just individual adaptability. It required the ability to work together, to share information, and to coordinate their activities in ways that would have been impossible for their solitary ancestors. The social brain that had begun to evolve in the Eocene forests was becoming an essential tool for navigating the challenges of a more demanding world. The primates in particular were pushing the boundaries of what social cooperation could accomplish. The groups that were most successful in adapting to the changing conditions were those that could balance individual competition with collective action, personal survival with group cohesion. They were developing the cognitive and social foundations that would eventually give rise to the most sophisticated forms of mammalian intelligence. But that story was still millions of years in the future. In the early Oligocene, the mammals were still very much in the process of adapting to their new world, still experimenting with different strategies and different solutions to the challenges of life in a cooling planet. They were writing the next chapter in the story of mammalian evolution, one adaptation at a time. The world had changed dramatically since the asteroid impact that had ended the age of dinosaurs. The mammals that had started as small secretive survivors hiding in the shadows of giant reptiles had become the dominant force in terrestrial ecosystems. They had proven that intelligence, adaptability, and social cooperation could be more powerful than size, strength, or specialized weaponry. But they had also learned that success in evolution is never permanent, that the skills and strategies that work in one environment may be liabilities in another. The mammals that thrived in the cooling world of the Oligocene were those that could maintain the flexibility and innovation that had served their ancestors so well, while adapting to the new challenges and opportunities that each environmental change brought. The story of mammalian evolution was far from over. The cooling trend that had begun in the Oligocene would continue, creating new challenges and new opportunities for innovation. The grasslands that had emerged during this period would expand and diversify, supporting new types of mammalian communities. The social behaviors that had been refined in response to environmental stress would evolve into increasingly sophisticated forms of cooperation and communication. And somewhere in the future, one particular lineage of primates would take the cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating the challenges of arboreal life and apply them to challenges that no other mammal had ever faced. They would learn to control fire, to make tools, to communicate with symbols, and eventually to understand their own place in the long history of life on Earth. But that story was still millions of years away. For now, in the cooling world of the early Oligocene, the mammals were still very much in the process of learning how to live in their new world, still experimenting with different strategies and different solutions to the challenges of survival on a changing planet. They were the inheritors of a world that had been transformed by catastrophe, and they were transforming it once again through their own innovations and adaptations. The mammalian takeover of Earth was complete, but the story of what they would do with their inheritance was just beginning, and it would prove to be one of the most remarkable stories in the history of life itself. Around 30 million years ago, the Earth was settling into a rhythm that would define the next phase of mammalian evolution. The dramatic cooling of the Oligocene had stabilized into something more predictable, though still far removed from the hothouse world that had nurtured the early mammals. The planet was learning to live with ice caps again, with seasonal variations that hadn't existed for millions of years, and with new patterns of rainfall and temperature that would reshape the very foundations of terrestrial life. The mammals that emerged from this climatic transition weren't just survivors of environmental change. They were pioneers of a new kind of existence, one that required different strategies, different social structures, and different ways of thinking about the world around them. The forests that had once stretched unbroken from pole to pole were now fragmented into islands of green, surrounded by vast expanses of something entirely new, grassland. This wasn't just a change in scenery. It was a fundamental reorganization of how energy moved through terrestrial ecosystems. The grassland that was spreading across the continents represented a completely different approach to capturing and storing solar energy. Instead of locking carbon away in massive tree trunks that took centuries to decompose, grasses created rapid cycles of growth and decay that could support entirely different types of animal communities. The mammals that learned to exploit these new grassland ecosystems weren't just adapting to a different type of food, they were adapting to a different pace of life entirely. Grasslands were dynamic, seasonal, and unpredictable in ways that forests had never been. The animals that thrived in these environments needed to be mobile, flexible, and capable of making rapid decisions about when to move, where to feed, and how to avoid the predators that were also adapting to life in open country. The ruminants that had begun to emerge during the late Eocene were perfectly positioned to take advantage of these new conditions. Their multi-chambered digestive systems allowed them to extract maximum nutrition from the tough, fibrous grasses that were becoming increasingly dominant. But more than that, their ability to regurgitate and rechew their food meant that they could feed quickly in dangerous open areas and then retreat to safer locations to complete the digestive process. This behavioral flexibility was crucial in grassland environments where visibility was high and predators could approach from any direction. The ruminants weren't just processing grass more efficiently than their competitors, they were doing so in ways that minimized their exposure to danger. It was a perfect example of how anatomical innovations could enable entirely new behavioral strategies. But the ruminants weren't the only mammals learning to exploit the expanding grasslands. Other herbivorous lineages were developing their own solutions to the challenges of grass consumption. Some evolved continuously growing teeth that could withstand the abrasive effects of silica-rich grasses. Others developed different types of gut bacteria that could break down cellulose more efficiently. Still others compensated for the low nutritional quality of grass by simply eating more of it, developing larger body sizes that could support the massive digestive systems needed for bulk processing. The diversity of solutions that emerged was testament to the creative power of evolution when faced with new challenges. The mammals weren't just adapting to grasslands, they were exploring every possible way of making a living in these new environments, and each successful innovation created new opportunities for other species to exploit. The predators that hunted these grassland herbivores were facing their own evolutionary challenges. The ambush tactics that had worked so well in forest environments were largely useless in open country where prey animals could see for miles in every direction. The carnivores that succeeded in grassland environments were those that could either outrun their prey or coordinate their hunting efforts to overcome the advantages of visibility and mobility. The evolution of cursorial predators, those specialized for sustained high-speed pursuit, was one of the most dramatic developments of this period. These animals weren't just faster versions of their forest-dwelling ancestors. They were fundamentally different organisms with longer limbs, more efficient cardiovascular systems, and enhanced sensory abilities for tracking prey across vast distances. The arms race between grassland predators and their prey drove some of the most impressive examples of mammalian athleticism in the fossil record. Both sides were pushing the limits of what was physiologically possible, developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for pursuit and evasion. The result was a level of athletic performance that wouldn't have been possible in the more constrained environments of forest ecosystems. But speed wasn't the only solution to the challenges of grassland predation. Some carnivorous mammals began to develop more sophisticated social hunting strategies, coordinating their efforts to surround and capture prey that would have been impossible for individual hunters to take down. This required new types of communication systems, new forms of behavioral coordination, and new cognitive abilities for understanding and predicting the behavior of both prey and hunting partners. The evolution of pack hunting represented a significant advance in mammalian social organization. It required animals to suppress their individual hunting instincts in favor of coordinated group action, to communicate effectively about the location and movement of prey, and to share the rewards of successful hunts according to complex social hierarchies. These developments weren't limited to predators. The herbivores that were targeted by pack hunters were developing their own sophisticated anti-predator strategies. Some species began forming large herds that could provide early warning of approaching predators and confuse attackers through sheer numbers. Others developed complex migration patterns that allowed them to exploit seasonal resources while avoiding areas where predators were most active. The evolution of herding behavior required its own set of cognitive and social adaptations. Animals living in large groups needed to be able to coordinate their movements, communicate about threats and opportunities, and maintain social cohesion while competing for limited resources. The social dynamics of these early herds were laying the groundwork for some of the most complex mammalian societies that would emerge in later periods. The primates, meanwhile, were facing their own challenges in adapting to the post-greenhouse world. The cognitive abilities that had been refined in the complex three-dimensional environments of Eocene forests were still valuable, but they needed to be applied to new types of problems. Some primate lineages were beginning to spend more time on the ground, developing new locomotory strategies for moving across increasingly open landscapes. The transition from purely arboreal to semi-terrestrial lifestyles wasn't straightforward for mammals that had spent millions of years perfecting their tree-climbing abilities. Ground dwelling required different types of sensory processing, different social behaviors, and different strategies for avoiding predators. The primates that successfully made this transition were those that could maintain the cognitive flexibility that had served them so well in the trees while adapting to the new challenges of terrestrial life. Some primate populations began to develop new types of social organization that were better suited to life in more open environments. The small dispersed groups that had been optimal for forest living gave way to larger, more cohesive social units that could provide better protection against predators and more efficient exploitation of scattered food resources. The evolution of more complex social systems required new types of cognitive abilities. Primates needed to be able to track the relationships and hierarchies within larger groups, to coordinate their activities across greater distances, and to communicate more effectively about threats and opportunities. The social brain that had begun to evolve in the Eocene forests was being refined and expanded to meet these new challenges. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the emergence of new forms of environmental manipulation. The primates that were most successful in adapting to the changing conditions were those that could actively modify their environment to make it more suitable for their needs. This might involve simple behaviors like nest building or food storage, but it represented a fundamental shift in how mammals interacted with their world. The ability to modify the environment required new types of cognitive abilities, including the capacity for forward planning, the ability to understand cause and effect relationships, and the development of what would later be recognized as primitive forms of tool use. The primates weren't just adapting to their environment, they were beginning to shape it. This environmental manipulation had cascading effects throughout the ecosystems where these primates lived. Their activities influenced plant distributions, affected soil chemistry, and created new types of habitat structures that benefited other species. The primates were becoming ecosystem engineers, species whose activities had effects that extended far beyond their immediate survival needs. The mammals that were thriving in the grassland-dominated world of the late Oligocene were demonstrating new levels of behavioral sophistication. They were developing complex social systems, sophisticated communication strategies, and innovative solutions to the challenges of life in open environments. But they were also becoming increasingly specialized, adapting to specific ecological niches in ways that would make them vulnerable to future environmental changes. The diversity of mammalian life that emerged during this period was unprecedented. Different lineages were exploring different solutions to the same basic challenges, creating a level of ecological complexity that hadn't existed since the early days of mammalian evolution. The grasslands weren't just supporting more mammals. They were supporting more different types of mammals, each with their own specialized adaptations and behavioral strategies. The success of these grassland mammals was beginning to influence the evolution of the plant communities they depended on. Grasses were evolving new strategies for surviving grazing pressure, developing growth patterns that could recover quickly from herbivore damage and chemical defenses that could deter overconsumption. The coevolution between grasses and grazing mammals was creating feedback loops that would shape the structure of grassland ecosystems for millions of years to come. But the mammals weren't just passive participants in this coevolutionary process. They were active agents of environmental change, their feeding behaviors and movement patterns influencing the distribution and abundance of plant species across the landscape. The most successful mammals were those that could balance their immediate needs with the long-term sustainability of the resources they depended on. The late Oligocene was a time of remarkable innovation in mammalian evolution. The mammals that had survived the transition from the greenhouse world were proving that they could adapt to almost any environmental challenge. They were developing new ways of moving, new ways of feeding, new ways of communicating, and new ways of organizing their social lives. But they were also setting the stage for even more dramatic changes to come. The cooling trend that had begun in the Oligocene would continue, creating new challenges and new opportunities for mammalian evolution. The grasslands that had emerged during this period would expand and diversify, supporting new types of mammalian communities. The social behaviors that had been refined in response to environmental stress would evolve into increasingly sophisticated forms of cooperation and communication. The mammals of the late Oligocene weren't just adapting to their changing world, they were actively shaping it. Their innovations were creating new types of ecological relationships, new forms of environmental interaction, and new possibilities for future evolutionary development. They were writing the next chapter in the story of life on Earth, one adaptation at a time. The world that emerged from the Oligocene was fundamentally different from the one that had existed during the greenhouse period. It was cooler, drier, and more seasonally variable. It was dominated by grasslands rather than forests, by open spaces rather than closed canopies. And it was inhabited by mammals that were more diverse, more sophisticated, and more ecologically significant than any that had come before. These mammals had proven that intelligence, adaptability, and social cooperation could be more powerful than size, strength, or specialized weaponry. They had demonstrated that evolutionary success wasn't just about surviving environmental change, but about thriving in the face of it. And they had shown that the innovations developed in response to one set of challenges could be applied to entirely different problems in entirely different environments. The stage was set for the next phase of mammalian evolution, where the lessons learned in the cooling world of the Oligocene would be applied to new challenges and new opportunities, where the cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating complex social environments would be refined and expanded to meet even greater challenges, and where the mammals that had inherited the earth would continue to transform it through their own innovations and adaptations. The story of mammalian evolution was entering a new phase, one that would be defined by increasing complexity, increasing sophistication, and increasing influence on the planetary systems that supported all life. The mammals had come a long way from their origins as small, secretive creatures hiding in the shadows of dinosaurs. They had become the architects of a new world, and they were just getting started. As the Oligocene drew to a close, the mammals that had inherited the cooling earth were preparing for the next chapter in their evolutionary story. They had survived the transition from the greenhouse world, adapted to life in grassland environments, and developed new forms of social organization that would serve them well in the challenges to come. They were ready for whatever the future might bring, armed with the cognitive abilities, social skills, and behavioral flexibility that had served them so well in the past. The mammalian takeover of Earth was complete, but the story of what they would do with their inheritance was just beginning, and it would prove to be one of the most remarkable stories in the history of life itself. The transition into the Miocene, beginning around 23 million years ago, marked the dawn of what would become one of the most dynamic periods in mammalian evolutionary history. The world that emerged from the Oligocene wasn't just cooler and drier than its greenhouse predecessors. It was fundamentally more unstable, more seasonal, and more demanding of the creatures that called it home. This instability wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The climate fluctuations, the seasonal variations, the unpredictable rainfall patterns that characterized the early Miocene created exactly the kind of environmental pressure that drives evolutionary innovation. The mammals that had learned to thrive in the grassland-dominated world of the late Oligocene were about to discover that their education was far from complete. The grasslands themselves were evolving, becoming more diverse and more specialized. What had started as relatively simple grass-dominated ecosystems were developing into complex mosaics of different vegetation types, each with its own seasonal rhythms, its own nutritional profiles, and its own challenges for the animals that depended on them. Some grasses were becoming more drought-tolerant, others more cold-resistant. Some were developing new chemical defenses against herbivores, others were becoming more nutritious to attract the grazers that helped disperse their seeds. This diversification of grassland ecosystems created new opportunities for mammalian specialization. The generalist feeding strategies that had served mammals well during the transition from forest to grassland were giving way to more focused approaches. Some herbivorous mammals began specializing in specific types of grasses, developing the digestive machinery needed to extract maximum nutrition from particular plant species. Others became seasonal specialists, following the growth patterns of different grasses throughout the year. The ruminants, in particular, were pushing the boundaries of what their four-chambered digestive systems could accomplish. Some lineages were developing larger and more complex rumen chambers, creating more space for the bacterial fermentation that broke down tough plant fibers. Others were refining the efficiency of their rumination process, reducing the time and energy costs of rechewing their food. Still others were experimenting with different types of gut bacteria that could handle previously inedible plant materials. But the real innovation was happening in the realm of behavior. The ruminants weren't just processing grass more efficiently. They were developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for locating the best food sources, avoiding predators while feeding, and coordinating their movements with other members of their herds. They were becoming students of their environment, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated where the best grazing could be found and when it was safe to feed. This behavioral sophistication required new types of cognitive abilities. The ruminants needed to be able to remember the locations of good feeding sites, to predict when different types of grasses would be at their most nutritious, and to communicate this information to other members of their groups. They were developing what could only be called a culture of grazing, passing information about feeding strategies from generation to generation through observation and imitation. The predators that hunted these increasingly sophisticated herbivores were facing their own evolutionary challenges. The pack hunting strategies that had emerged during the Oligocene were being refined and expanded to deal with prey that was becoming more alert, more coordinated, and more difficult to catch. Some carnivorous mammals were developing more complex communication systems that allowed them to coordinate their hunting efforts across greater distances and longer time periods. Others were experimenting with different types of hunting strategies altogether. Instead of relying purely on speed or coordination, some predators began developing more patient, strategic approaches to hunting. They learned to study the behavior patterns of their prey, to predict where herds would move, and to position themselves for ambush attacks that took advantage of the herbivore's own behavioral routines. The evolution of these more sophisticated hunting strategies required new types of cognitive abilities. Predators needed to be able to understand and predict the behavior of their prey, to plan their attacks several steps in advance, and to adjust their strategies based on the responses of their targets. They were developing what could be called a theory of mind, the ability to understand that other animals had their own thoughts, intentions, and behavioral patterns that could be predicted and manipulated. This cognitive arms race between predators and prey was driving innovation on both sides. The herbivores that survived were those that could anticipate and counter the hunting strategies of their predators. The predators that succeeded were those that could stay one step ahead of their prey's defensive innovations. The result was an escalating cycle of behavioral and cognitive evolution that pushed both groups toward increasing sophistication. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the emergence of new forms of social organization that went beyond simple herding or pack hunting. Some mammalian species began developing multi-generational groups with complex hierarchical structures where older, more experienced individuals played crucial roles in guiding the behavior of younger group members. These weren't just breeding groups or feeding associations. They were learning communities where knowledge about survival strategies was accumulated and transmitted across generations. The primates were at the forefront of this social revolution. The cognitive abilities that have been developed for navigating complex three-dimensional forest environments were being applied to the challenge of navigating equally complex social environments. Some primate species were developing social groups with dozens of individuals, each with their own relationships, alliances, and positions in the group hierarchy. Managing these complex social relationships required new types of cognitive abilities. Primates needed to be able to track the relationships between multiple individuals, to understand how changes in one relationship might affect others, and to predict how different individuals would respond to various social situations. They were developing what researchers would later call social intelligence, the ability to understand and manipulate complex social systems. This social intelligence wasn't just useful for managing relationships within the group. It was also valuable for dealing with other groups, for forming alliances, for negotiating conflicts, and for coordinating activities across multiple social units. The primates that were most successful in this social environment were those that could balance competition with cooperation, individual interests with group needs, and short-term gains with long-term relationships. The development of these complex social systems had profound implications for primate evolution. Groups that could coordinate their activities more effectively had advantages in finding food, avoiding predators, and raising their young. The cognitive abilities that were being refined in these social environments were creating positive feedback loops that drove further increases in brain size and behavioral complexity. But the primates weren't the only mammals developing more sophisticated social systems. Some of the herbivorous mammals were also experimenting with new forms of group organization. Instead of simple herds that moved together for protection, some species began developing more structured societies with specialized roles for different individuals. Some members of the group specialized in detecting predators, others in finding food, still others in caring for the young. These specialized roles required new types of behavioral flexibility. Animals needed to be able to switch between different behavioral modes depending on the needs of the group and the demands of the situation. They needed to be able to communicate effectively about their specialized knowledge and to coordinate their activities with other specialists. They were developing what could be called division of labor, the ability to organize group activities around specialized skills and knowledge. The evolution of these more complex social systems was being driven partly by the increasing unpredictability of the Miocene environment. The climate fluctuations and seasonal variations that characterized this period meant that survival strategies that worked in one year might fail in the next. The mammals that were most successful were those that could pool their knowledge and experience, creating group memory systems that could guide behavior across multiple generations and multiple environmental cycles. This pooling of knowledge wasn't just about remembering where food could be found or how to avoid predators. It was about understanding the deeper patterns that governed environmental change, the relationships between different ecological factors, and the long-term consequences of different behavioral choices. The mammals were developing what could be called ecological intelligence, the ability to understand and predict the complex systems that governed their survival. The development of ecological intelligence required new types of cognitive abilities. Animals needed to be able to understand cause and effect relationships across multiple time scales, to recognize patterns in environmental change, and to predict the long-term consequences of their actions. They were developing what researchers would later recognize as the cognitive foundations for environmental management and ecosystem engineering. Some mammalian species were beginning to actively modify their environments in ways that improved their survival prospects. This might involve simple behaviors like creating trails between feeding areas and water sources, or more complex activities like selective grazing that maintained the plant communities they depended on. The mammals weren't just adapting to their environment. They were beginning to shape it in ways that supported their own needs and the needs of their descendants. This environmental manipulation had cascading effects throughout the ecosystems where these mammals lived. Their activities influenced plant distributions, affected soil chemistry, and created new types of habitat structures that benefited other species. The mammals were becoming ecosystem engineers, species whose activities had effects that extended far beyond their immediate survival needs. The success of these ecosystem engineering activities required new types of cognitive abilities. Animals needed to be able to understand the long-term consequences of their actions, to predict how environmental modifications would affect other species, and to coordinate their activities with other members of their groups. They were developing what could be called systems thinking, the ability to understand and manipulate complex ecological relationships. As the Miocene progressed, the mammals that were most successful were those that could integrate all of these different types of intelligence. The social intelligence needed to navigate complex group relationships. The ecological intelligence needed to understand environmental systems, and the behavioral flexibility needed to adapt to changing conditions. They were developing what could be called general intelligence, the ability to apply cognitive skills to a wide range of different problems and situations. This general intelligence wasn't just useful for solving individual problems. It was also valuable for cultural transmission, the ability to pass knowledge and skills from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation. The mammals that were most successful in developing cultural transmission were those that could create stable social environments where learning could take place, where knowledge could be accumulated across generations, and where innovations could be tested and refined. The emergence of cultural transmission marked a fundamental shift in how mammalian evolution operated. Instead of relying solely on genetic changes that took thousands of years to spread through populations, mammals could now adapt to new challenges through behavioral innovations that could be transmitted within a single generation. This dramatically accelerated the pace of adaptation and opened up new possibilities for evolutionary change. The mammals that were most successful in exploiting these new possibilities were those that could balance genetic adaptation with cultural innovation. They were species that could maintain the genetic foundations for learning and behavioral flexibility, while developing cultural systems that could guide behavior in specific environments and situations. They were creating what could be called gene-culture coevolution, the interaction between genetic and cultural evolution that would become increasingly important in later periods. The Miocene was proving to be a period of unprecedented innovation in mammalian evolution. The mammals that had survived the transition from the greenhouse world were not just adapting to new environmental challenges. They were developing entirely new ways of thinking about and interacting with their world. They were creating new forms of social organization, new types of ecological relationships, and new possibilities for future evolutionary development. But they were also setting the stage for even more dramatic changes to come. The cognitive abilities that were being developed in response to the challenges of the Miocene would eventually be applied to problems that no mammal had ever faced before. The social systems that were emerging would evolve into increasingly sophisticated forms of cooperation and communication. And the environmental manipulation that was beginning to appear would eventually develop into the ability to reshape entire landscapes and ecosystems. The mammals of the Miocene weren't just writing the next chapter in their own evolutionary story. They were laying the groundwork for developments that would eventually lead to the emergence of consciousness, language, and technology. They were creating the cognitive and social foundations that would make possible the most remarkable evolutionary experiment in the history of life on Earth. The development of a species that could understand its own evolutionary history and consciously direct its own future development. But that story was still millions of years in the future. For now, in the dynamic world of the Miocene, the mammals were focused on more immediate challenges, learning to live in an unstable environment, developing the social and cognitive skills needed to thrive in complex group societies, and creating the cultural systems that would allow them to pass their innovations on to future generations. They were proving that intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation could overcome almost any environmental challenge, and they were setting the stage for even greater achievements to come. The mammalian inheritance of Earth was proving to be more than just a matter of filling ecological niches left vacant by the dinosaurs. It was becoming a story of continuous innovation, of endless adaptation, and of the remarkable creativity that emerges when life is given the freedom to explore new possibilities. The mammals had come a long way from their origins as small, secretive creatures hiding in the shadows of giant reptiles. They had become the architects of a new kind of world, and they were just beginning to discover what that world might become. The stage was set for the next phase of mammalian evolution, where the innovations of the Miocene would be tested against new challenges and new opportunities, where the cognitive abilities that had been developed for navigating complex social and ecological environments would be refined and expanded to meet even greater challenges, and where the mammals that had inherited the Earth would continue to transform it through their own innovations and adaptations, creating new possibilities for life that had never existed before in the history of the planet. The story of mammalian evolution was entering its most dramatic phase, one that would culminate in the emergence of species capable of understanding their own place in the vast sweep of evolutionary history. But that understanding would only be possible because of the foundations that were being laid in the dynamic world of the Miocene, where mammals were learning to think, to cooperate, and to shape their own evolutionary destiny. The story that began with an asteroid and a moment of cosmic violence was reaching its most extraordinary chapter. By around 20 million years ago, the mammals that had inherited a broken world had not just repaired it, they had reimagined what life itself could become. The descendants of those small, frightened creatures hiding in burrows while the earth burned overhead were now the authors of something unprecedented. A planet where intelligence was becoming as important as strength, where cooperation was proving more powerful than competition, and where the ability to learn was beginning to matter more than the ability to survive. The world they inhabited was unrecognizable from the one their ancestors had known. The climate had stabilized into patterns that, while still challenging, offered the kind of predictable seasonal rhythms that complex societies could plan around. The grasslands that had emerged from the cooling world were now vast, interconnected ecosystems that supported migrations of unprecedented scale. And in the remaining forests, particularly in Africa and Asia, something remarkable was happening in the canopy. The primates that had spent millions of years perfecting their arboreal lifestyle were pushing the boundaries of what social intelligence could accomplish. Some species were developing communication systems that went far beyond simple alarm calls or territorial displays. They were creating what could only be called primitive languages, with different vocalizations for different types of food sources, different predator threats, and different social situations. More remarkably, these communication systems were being modified and refined by different populations, creating what researchers would later recognize as the first glimmers of cultural diversity. Young primates weren't just learning how to find food or avoid predators. They were learning how to be members of their particular social group with its own traditions, its own communication patterns, and its own ways of solving problems. The process of growing up was becoming an extended educational experience, where the accumulated wisdom of generations was being passed down through patient instruction and careful observation. This extended period of learning was only possible because of another remarkable development: the evolution of grandmothers. Some primate species were developing lifespans that extended well beyond their reproductive years, creating a new social role for older individuals who could contribute to group survival through their knowledge and experience rather than their ability to produce offspring. These post-reproductive individuals became living libraries, repositories of information about environmental cycles, food sources, and survival strategies that spanned multiple generations. The presence of grandmothers in primate societies had cascading effects on social organization. Groups could maintain larger populations because older individuals could help care for the young, allowing parents to invest more time in foraging and group defense. The accumulated knowledge of long-lived individuals could guide group decisions about when to move, where to feed, and how to respond to environmental changes. Most importantly, the presence of individuals who had lived through multiple environmental cycles created a form of institutional memory that could guide group behavior across decades and even centuries. This institutional memory was becoming increasingly important as the Miocene world continued to change. The climate fluctuations that characterized this period meant that strategies that worked in one decade might fail in the next. The primate groups that were most successful were those that could remember not just recent conditions, but long-term patterns of environmental change. They were developing what could be called historical consciousness, the ability to understand their present circumstances in the context of past experience and future possibilities. But the primates weren't the only mammals developing more sophisticated forms of social organization. On the grasslands, some herbivorous species were experimenting with new forms of collective decision-making. Instead of simple following behaviors where the entire herd moved in response to the actions of a single leader, some species were developing more democratic systems where multiple individuals could influence group decisions based on their knowledge of local conditions. These democratic decision-making processes required new types of cognitive abilities. Animals needed to be able to assess the quality of information provided by different individuals, to weigh competing proposals for group action, and to reach consensus in situations where different group members had different preferences. They were developing what could be called political intelligence, the ability to navigate complex group decision-making processes. The evolution of political intelligence was being driven by the increasing complexity of the environments these mammals inhabited. The grassland ecosystems of the Miocene were not uniform expanses of grass. They were complex mosaics of different vegetation types, water sources, and seasonal resources that required sophisticated knowledge to navigate successfully. The groups that could pool their knowledge and make collective decisions about resource use were those that thrived in these complex environments. Some species were even developing primitive forms of what would later be recognized as resource management. Instead of simply consuming whatever food was available, some herbivorous mammals were beginning to modify their grazing patterns in ways that maintained the plant communities they depended on. They were learning to balance immediate nutritional needs with long-term ecosystem health, creating sustainable relationships with their environment that could persist across multiple generations. This environmental stewardship required new types of cognitive abilities. Animals needed to be able to understand the long-term consequences of their actions, to predict how different grazing patterns would affect plant communities, and to coordinate their activities with other members of their groups to implement sustainable resource use strategies. They were developing what could be called conservation intelligence, the ability to manage resources in ways that ensured their long-term availability. The development of conservation intelligence was particularly important for the mammals that were beginning to have significant impacts on their environments. The large herbivores that roamed the grasslands weren't just passive consumers of vegetation. They were ecosystem engineers whose feeding activities influenced plant distributions, soil chemistry, and water cycles. The species that learned to manage these impacts were those that could maintain stable relationships with their environment across multiple generations. The predators that hunted these increasingly sophisticated herbivores were facing their own evolutionary challenges. The pack hunting strategies that had emerged during earlier periods were being refined into increasingly complex forms of cooperative behavior. Some carnivorous mammals were developing hunting strategies that required coordination across multiple days, with different individuals playing specialized roles in tracking, surrounding, and capturing prey. These extended hunting campaigns required new types of cognitive abilities. Predators needed to be able to plan their activities across multiple timescales, to coordinate their actions with other pack members across great distances, and to maintain group cohesion during long periods of unsuccessful hunting. They were developing what could be called strategic intelligence, the ability to plan and execute complex, long-term cooperative activities. The evolution of strategic intelligence was having profound effects on predator-prey relationships. The herbivores that survived were those that could anticipate and counter the increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies of their predators. Some species were developing early warning systems that could detect predator activities from great distances and across extended time periods. Others were creating defensive alliances with other species, forming multi-species herds that could provide enhanced protection against predators. The result was an escalating cycle of cognitive evolution that was pushing both predators and prey toward increasing behavioral sophistication. The mammals of the Miocene weren't just bigger or faster than their predecessors. They were smarter, more socially complex, and more capable of long-term planning and cooperation. They were developing the cognitive foundations that would eventually make possible the most remarkable achievements in the history of life on Earth. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the emergence of what could only be called curiosity. Some mammalian species were beginning to explore their environment, not just for immediate survival needs, but for the simple pleasure of understanding how things work. Young animals were spending increasing amounts of time in play behaviors that seemed to serve no obvious survival function, but that helped them develop cognitive skills and social relationships. This curiosity-driven exploration was leading to innovations that went far beyond simple problem solving. Some primates were beginning to use tools not just for immediate tasks like extracting insects from bark, but for modifying their environment in ways that would benefit them in the future. They were creating what could be called proto-technology, the use of external objects to enhance their own capabilities and to solve problems that their bodies alone could not handle. The development of proto-technology required new types of cognitive abilities. Animals needed to be able to understand the physical properties of different materials, to envision how tools could be modified to improve their effectiveness, and to plan tool use activities that would benefit them in future situations. They were developing what could be called technological intelligence, the ability to understand and manipulate the physical world through the use of external tools. The emergence of technological intelligence was particularly significant because it represented a fundamental shift in how mammals interacted with their environment. Instead of being purely biological entities that adapted to environmental challenges through changes in their bodies or behaviors, some mammals were beginning to use external tools to modify their environment and enhance their own capabilities. They were taking the first steps toward becoming technological species. The implications of this development extended far beyond the immediate benefits of tool use. The mammals that were beginning to use tools were also beginning to understand the principles of cause and effect that governed the physical world. They were learning that their actions could have predictable consequences, that they could modify their environment to achieve desired outcomes, and that they could solve problems through the application of intelligence rather than just instinct. This understanding of cause and effect was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become scientific thinking. The mammals that were most successful in developing and using tools were those that could understand the underlying principles that made their tools effective, that could predict how modifications to their tools would affect their performance, and that could apply these principles to solve new problems in new situations. The development of scientific thinking was being accelerated by the social learning systems that were emerging in mammalian societies. The innovations that were being developed by individual animals were being transmitted to other members of their groups through teaching and imitation. This cultural transmission of technological knowledge was creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of innovation and allowed for the accumulation of technological knowledge across generations. The mammals that were most successful in exploiting these new possibilities were those that could balance individual innovation with social learning. They were species that could encourage individual creativity and experimentation while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for effective cultural transmission. They were creating what could be called innovative societies, social systems that were optimized for the generation and transmission of new ideas and technologies. The emergence of innovative societies was transforming the pace and nature of mammalian evolution. Instead of relying solely on genetic changes that took thousands of years to spread through populations, mammals could now adapt to new challenges through technological and behavioral innovations that could be transmitted within a single generation. This dramatically accelerated the pace of adaptation and opened up new possibilities for evolutionary change that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. The mammals of the late Miocene were proving that intelligence, cooperation, and technological innovation could overcome almost any environmental challenge. They were demonstrating that the cognitive abilities that had been developed in response to the challenges of complex social and ecological environments could be applied to problems that no animal had ever faced before. They were showing that the capacity for learning, innovation, and cultural transmission could create entirely new forms of evolutionary possibility. But they were also setting the stage for developments that would eventually lead to the emergence of consciousness, language, and civilization. The cognitive abilities that were being refined in the late Miocene would eventually be applied to problems of unprecedented complexity. The social systems that were emerging would evolve into forms of cooperation and communication that could coordinate the activities of millions of individuals. And the technological innovations that were beginning to appear would eventually develop into the ability to reshape entire planets and explore the cosmos itself. The mammals had come an extraordinary distance from their origins as small, secretive creatures hiding from dinosaurs and underground burrows. They had survived the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life, adapted to a completely transformed world, and developed new forms of intelligence and cooperation that had never existed before. They had proven that life could not just recover from catastrophe, but could use that catastrophe as an opportunity to explore entirely new possibilities for existence. The story of mammalian evolution was approaching its most dramatic phase, where the innovations of millions of years would culminate in the emergence of species capable of understanding their own place in the vast sweep of evolutionary history. But that understanding would only be possible because of the foundations that had been laid by countless generations of mammals who had learned to think, to cooperate, and to shape their own evolutionary destiny. The asteroid that had ended the age of dinosaurs had not just destroyed one world. It had made possible the creation of another, one where intelligence and cooperation could flourish in ways that had never been possible before. The mammals that inherited this new world had not just survived, they had thrived, adapted, and innovated in ways that would eventually make possible the most remarkable achievements in the history of life on Earth. And in the growing dusk of the Miocene, as the world prepared for the next phase of its extraordinary journey, the mammals that had spent millions of years learning to live together were beginning to discover what they might accomplish when they worked together. The stage was set for the final act of this remarkable story, where the descendants of those early survivors would take their first tentative steps toward becoming the conscious architects of their own future. The long journey from the asteroid impact to the emergence of consciousness was nearly complete. The mammals had proven that life could not just survive catastrophe, but could transform it into opportunity. They had shown that intelligence, cooperation, and innovation could overcome any challenge. And they had demonstrated that the capacity for learning and cultural transmission could create entirely new forms of evolutionary possibility. The story that began with destruction would end with creation. The mammals that had inherited a broken world had not just repaired it, they had reimagined what life itself could become. And in doing so, they had set the stage for the most remarkable chapter in the history of life on Earth, one where conscious beings would eventually look back on their own evolutionary history and understand for the first time the extraordinary journey that had brought them into existence. The Earth had rebooted after the dinosaur apocalypse, and in the process, it had created something unprecedented, a world where intelligence could flourish, where cooperation could triumph, and where the future was limited only by the imagination of the creatures that inhabited it. The mammals had not just survived, they had prevailed, and their story would continue to unfold in ways that would astonish and inspire for millions of years to come. If you appreciate this approach to learning, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps support this kind of long-form, evidence-based content in a world that often rewards the opposite.